All right, hi everybody. Thanks for being with us this evening. I'm Jennifer Miller. I'm a librarian in the Adult Services Department at the Scotch Plains Public Library. As you may know, the Scotch Plains Township's Green Team will be holding a free tree seedling drive-through giveaway this coming Saturday, and that's in celebration of this week's Earth Day, which I think is on Thursday. And that will be taking place outside the library between 9 a.m. and 11 a.m. And it is on a first come, first served basis. It is for residents of Scotch Plains Township. So whether you're planning to pick up a new tree seedling and you want to know how to get it off to a good start, or you want to know how to properly care for your existing trees, I think that you will learn what you need from our speaker this evening. I'd like to welcome Richard Miller. He's a New Jersey licensed landscape architect. He is president of the Garden Club of Metuchen, and he gave a really good program on pruning for us last year. And if you're interested in that, you can view it on our YouTube channel. So we're very pleased to have him back this evening, and he's going to share his knowledge of all aspects of tree care. So I will let him get started.
Thank you, Jennifer, for that nice introduction, and thank you all for coming. The presentation I'm giving tonight is going to be very similar to the one that I gave before, but I kind of tailored this more to trees in general, not just pruning. So I will start with this first slide, which is me standing next to a tree in Gettysburg that probably witnessed the Battle of Gettysburg. And it may not look too impressive in this picture, but if I go to the next slide, you'll see how big this tree is. And I guess the point is that if you take care of a tree properly, it could live for a very, very long time, and most trees can. So first off, the basics. The number one thing that you should remember is just because you see a landscaper or a tree person doing something out and about, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're doing the right thing. Especially that volcano mulch, or they put all that mulch on top of the trees. I'll talk more about this horrible situation of this tree later, but you get the idea. Don't do this. For those of you that are going to be getting a seedling, I was looking at the list of seedlings that you might potentially get. It's a very, very varied list of different types of trees. So I don't know what kind of tree you're going to be getting with your, whatever your seedling giveaway is going to be. But what you really need to do when you get that seedling is to find out what the species is, and you need to know what the mature size of that tree would be, and you would plant the tree in the location with that mature size in mind. Bearing in mind that a small understory tree will grow to about 20 feet in diameter or a little more than that. And that means that you should never put it 3 feet from the front of your house, because eventually that tree is going to be too big for that space. Conversely, a large tree can go 40 feet or more in diameter. So you want to have a large shade tree even further from your house. So figure out what the species is, and then find out what the mature size is and use that as a guide. The other thing is that the seedling that you're going to get is probably going to be about 8 or 9 inches tall, and it's going to be like a little stick with a little bit of roots on it. And you'll probably have to plant it in a pot to begin with, and then you're going to move it to a spot where it can be more protected, and then you'll eventually move it to its final location. Because it'll be, when it's a seedling, it'll be very easy to run over with your lawnmower, so just be careful. When you're talking about digging, and with a seedling, you're probably only going to be going down 6 inches, and it's not really going to be a big deal. But if you're digging anything big, you should always call 811. It's a free service, and that will have the utility companies come out and mark all your utilities to make sure that you don't hit any utilities, which would be a problem. Plus, it's also not a great idea to put a tree over your sewer line or your gas or your water line, because if they ever have to dig those up, then your tree gets dug up too. So it's always a better thing to have know where your utilities are. Also look up, are there wires overhead? If there are, you may not want to plant your big shade tree directly under your power lines, because that's another thing that's going to be a problem with the tree as it gets older. And then the utility company will come in and they'll just lop the top of it off. Some small trees can fit under wires, but others may not. So just bear in mind, if you have wires, it's always best to try to move, away from them. As far as tree planting, you want the tree to be at the same level it was. Like, let's say, hypothetically, it was in a pot, and the top of the soil in that pot, that is the level of the soil. The surrounding soil should be at the same level as the way that the tree was in the pot. You don't want it too high, and you don't want it too low. If you plant it too high, the roots will be exposed, and it won't grow properly. And then if it's too low, you could smother it and kill it, because the roots need air, and if they're too deep, they will not live. Also, if you have a mature tree, if you do a lot of fill on top of a mature tree, that will also kill it. This slide is a typical slide that shows a container grown tree that somebody planted, and when they put it in, they didn't remove all the girdling, circling roots when before they planted it in the ground. A lot of times if a plant has been in a pot for too long, the roots will grow out from the tree, and when they hit the plastic of the pot, they either go right or left. And when they turn right and then they start to go around the edge of that pot because they can't get through the plastic, this is what will happen. As this tree matures, it essentially would strangle itself because the roots would just kill the tree. So it's always a good idea if you're getting something in a container, would be to cut the roots that are girdling or circling around, tease the soil a little bit to kind of move the fibrous roots around, and just kind of, even if you take a razor blade and slice it vertically. I know that sounds like, oh God, how could you do that? But honestly, the plant or whatever you plant will do much better if you cut that massive roots on the outside of where the pot was. Mulching should be no more than 4 inches thick, and you should not have it piled up against the trunk of the tree, because it will kill your tree. It will cause suckering. It creates places for mice and voles to live, which will chew the bark of the tree, and it'll also smother the tree. So I know you see this everywhere you go, but this is wrong. So please don't do it. So now we're getting to the pruning section. So the following tips are going to be, how's the best way to prune. There were some questions in the chat that Jennifer had come up with. And one of the questions was, when is it appropriate to prune mature trees? And the answer of that would be, as per my professor from Rutgers University, Bruce Doc Hamilton would say, prune when the shears are sharp, which pretty much means you can prune anytime, but there's other things you need to be aware of. For example, if you got, this is the bark of a river birch that you can see in the photograph. Maple and birch trees have a tendency to have a lot of sap running in the spring. So if you do your pruning on a maple or a birch, and maple gives us maple syrup, and that's how they get it. But if you do your pruning in the spring, that wound will just be dripping and dripping and dripping for several weeks, and you may not want that. So if you do have a maple or a birch, you'd be better off cutting it in the summer or the fall or even the winter. But probably better off to not do it in the spring. Some other pruning considerations you should think of is that conifers and hollies have a strong central leader, and what that means is that they generally have a pyramidal form, and if you cut the central leader, which is your main trunk, what the plant is going to do, it's going to send out several co-dominant leaders, and they will all grow, and they will all think that they're the main leader. But what that'll do is that'll give you a very top-heavy plant. So what you should do is not cut the central leader, but if you do have a pine or a spruce or a holly where somebody did cut the central leader, you should sort of look at all of them. There should be maybe 3 or 4 of them. Find the best one that is, for the aesthetics of the plant, and cut the other ones off. So the tree only has one main branch, and that's just with conifers, hollies, and the like. You also want to remove water sprouts, which are those branches that spring up from the base of an older tree, and because they divert a lot of water nutrients that need to go elsewhere in the tree. This is that photo from earlier. This is called tipping, where somebody just cuts the branch at the end and not at a branch, not at a junction. What that does, and you can see in some of these pictures, is that it creates a thicket of branches on the end of that cut end, they're not going to be good branches. They're not going to be onto the tree very, strongly. So it's really not a good practice. And the proper way to prune is when you're pruning a larger branch, the branch that you're pruning it off from should be 2/3 of the diameter of the one that you're trimming. So keep that in mind when you're pruning, and you should always go back to the main branch. Don't leave a stub. And I have some illustrations for you to see. Why do you prune? So the main reasons for why you prune are safety, health, and aesthetics. So we'll talk about safety first. Trees, if they're out in the woods, they fall all the time. And they're not necessarily unsafe because there's really nothing for them to hit. They hit other trees. But if you have a tree near your house, your garage, or in a park where a lot of people will congregate, a tree can be dangerous. So you need to be able to recognize some of the indications of what would make a tree dangerous. So you would want to check them for dead limbs, root rot, and hollowness. So this tree was in Edison. It came down in the storm, and from I guess before it was cut up like this, it had a lot of growth, and it looked pretty healthy. But I'm going to show you in the next slide why this tree failed. And if you look at the trunk, the main part of the trunk here, it's hollow. And the main reason why this tree fell is because it really had no heartwood. And the heartwood of the tree is really what they call the deadwood. But the deadwood is really the structure of the tree, and that's what gives it the strength to stand up and hold all those leaves. The living part of the tree is really just the part right below the bark, and it's really not even very big. It's probably within like 1/4 of an inch of the tree, and that's where your xylem and your phloem is. The stuff in the center of the tree is basically dead, but it serves a purpose by giving your tree structure. And if you're unsure of whether your tree is hollow, one way to check that is if you look up high in the tree and you can see a big hole that looks hollow, it's a good bet that that tree is hollow all the way down to the ground. Like, something that like a squirrel or a raccoon might live in. You can call a licensed arborist, and they have like something called a pith increment borer, and they can they can put a tiny hole into the side of the tree, and they can tell you if it's hollow or not. But like I said, if you see a hole in the side of the tree, it's pretty much hollow. Another thing about safety is that oak trees in particular will tend to hold their deadwood for a long time. So as far as pruning, it's a good idea if you have a tree with deadwood, and deadwood is the stuff where nothing is really growing on. A lot of times you will notice the deadwood because the tree will you'll see that branch collar area, and then the dead part will be much smaller and obviously dead. And you should, if you have a lot of deadwood in your tree, if it could fall on somebody or something, you should probably have the deadwood taken out, especially if it's an oak tree, because the oaks will hold it for a really long time until this huge branch will come down on your car. So it's always better to remove the deadwood before it falls on you. As I said, check the base of the tree for root rot. You look for mushrooms. That's usually a bad sign. And also, if let's say if the borough came by and decided to do a new sidewalk and they cut all the roots on the one side of the tree, now that tree has just lost 50% of its stability because it has no roots on the right side of it anymore. So if the wind blows from that direction, it could topple over because it has nothing to keep it in the ground. Here's an example of what my arborist friend Adam would call fruiting bodies at the base of a tree. When you see a tree that has mushrooms growing from the root zone, the root area, that's a warning sign. So you should, keep your eyes open, look for evidence of rot and hollowness, and that should make you a pretty good dangerous tree spotter. And if you ever are unsure, I would say just, find a licensed arborist. I don't know if necessarily every tree guy or tree cutting guy is like an expert. They know how to cut trees. They don't necessarily all know how, they're not necessarily all arborists. So it's better to get somebody who knows what they're talking about. Another reason to prune is for health. So this illustration here shows two branch unions, a U shape versus a V shape. The U shape is on the left and the V shape is on the right. The reason why the V shape is not so healthy is because it has something called included bark, meaning that the bark on both of those branches are included in that space in between. And as the branches grow, that bark forms like a wedge, which essentially pushes the branches apart. So in a storm, they could fall off. Typically, if you look at our downtowns in New Jersey, a lot of, in the 80s, they planted a lot of these Bradford calorie pears. You'll notice a lot of those have really, really poor V-shaped branch unions, and a lot of them will just, the whole half of the tree will just break off because they have a lot of V-shaped unions with included bark. And also, removal of deadwood is better for the tree health because, having all that deadwood is a stressor for the tree. To have all these open wounds, diseases can get in, bugs can get in, carpet ants. So it's much better to cut the deadwood and let the tree heal over itself. You should also, when you have storm damage like this and you have a hanging branch, always a good idea to call a professional and have them remove that, because you never know in the next storm, if there's a lot of wind, that branch could come loose and kill somebody. So always, keep your wits about you with the trees. And to be honest, I know there are some people that just want to cut down all their trees because they're afraid of the trees falling on their house. The main thing is that if a tree is properly cared for and pruned properly and have the deadwood taken out and whatever, it could last a very long time and be very safe. So you don't have to kill your tree or remove your tree in order to have a safe tree. So the last reason that you would want to cut your tree is for aesthetics. In this picture, you can see the houses on the left. This dogwood was planted way too close to this house. And look, it's also under some wires. So if you want to talk about the absolute worst placement, I mean, it looks nice visually, but it's too close to the house and it's underneath wires, but it's there. What are you going to do? And then if you look at the tree behind it, that's an American holly. That holly was topped at one point just below where the top of the dogwood is. And as you can see in the picture, there are three codominant leaders on this holly. So instead of the holly having a pyramidal shape where it's narrower at the top and wider at the bottom, it's pretty much a block. It's like a rectangle because it has all this growth on top. So it's, like I said, it's better to always remove your codominant leaders and just have the one that's the most aesthetic. So how do you prune? Use the correct tools. The correct tools would be your pruning saw, a root pruning saw, bypass shears, bypass loppers, gloves, eye protection, and disinfectant. The disinfectant is probably your most important thing when you're talking about pruning, especially because all plants, just like we get COVID and we've got all kinds of diseases, we catch the flu, plants can get fungi and other diseases that are bad for them. And if you don't sterilize your pruning tools after each use, you could spread that pathogen from one plant to the next. So if you remember anything from this presentation, just, carry a spray bottle of rubbing alcohol with you when you're doing pruning. And before you go from one plant to the next, just spray down your tools with some rubbing alcohol, and um, that will sterilize them so you don't spread any pests or diseases. This is a typical pruning saw. You'll notice that the shape is slightly curved. It's very narrow. This particular brand has a little button here where you can make it like a switchblade, and it folds in on itself, so it's a little safer. You don't have to worry about getting cut on it. But the size and the shape of it makes it ideal for getting into tight branch unions. So it's a nice thing to have, a good pruning saw. This is a root pruning saw. That is, if you have that, if we go back to that tree that had the roots circling around, you could take this root pruning saw and just cut some of those roots. This is a very rigid, it's a short, rigid saw, and it's used to go down into the dirt and where the roots are and just cut the roots that are maybe girdling the tree or something like that. These are called bypass shears. I prefer these over the anvil pruners. Anvil pruners are the one that have like a flat thing and a flat blade. And what that tends to do is it tends to crush the end of the stem. And I think that it doesn't give you a clean cut. So that's why I like the bypass shears the best. You may have heard of the Felco number 36 or whatever. They're a little on the pricey side, but you can get knockoff Felcos that look similar to this for a much cheaper price at one of your big box stores. As long as they're bypass, you're good to go. Oh, and I'm going to go back to this. So the bypass shears, these would be for small branches, maybe no more than a ½ inch in diameter. If the branches are bigger than that, you need a little more leverage, and that's why you use bypass loppers. So having these long handles really gives you a lot more leverage to get those bigger branches. And these would probably go up to about an inch. Anything larger than an inch or almost an inch, you'd be better off using a pruning saw. And then these are your last three things: some gloves, some goggles, and some rubbing alcohol for your sterilization. Okay. So here are some pictures of what not to do. This is a poorly done cut. So from this picture that you're looking at now, it doesn't look too bad, but one of the things I'll have you look at is if you look on the right side of the cut, it looks like the tree is starting to have that, to heal over that, but on the left side, it looks like it's just never going to get there. And when I look at the next slide, you'll see why, because this branch was cut at such an angle that on the photo on the left, if you see where the end of the cut was, it was in the right place, but the other side of that branch was about maybe 3 inches too far out. So this will never ever heal because the branch, the bark will never come over this. And don't stub cut. Stub cutting is probably worse than anything else because you basically leave this little dead piece of a branch that will never be healed over. It'll start to rot. It'll attract carpenter ants and all kinds of stuff. And then you'll also get water sprouts growing around it, which are also not good. If you look at this branch, if you look at this on the left, you can see that at the branch collar, this oak tree is trying really hard to cover over this stub cut, but it's also never going to cover over that stub. And then it sent out these water sprouts on either side, these weird branches that are just coming out of the trunk. So it's just not a good situation. Here are two other examples of stub cuts that are also never going to heal. I mean, the tree has been trying very hard and If this had been pruned properly, these two stub cuts probably would have been healed over by now. But it's been a very, very long time. You see the bark is coming off, and it's just a mess. So then you're probably wondering, well, what's the proper way to do a pruning? So the first step would be to make a small cut on the bottom of the branch to prevent bark ripping. And I have an illustration after the examples. The second step is you make the second cut about 8 to 12 inches from the trunk beyond the undercut. And the third step is you make the final cut just outside the branch collar. Don't flush cut or leave stubs. And here's an example to show you that. So the first cut is the letter A, where you cut it on the bottom, then letter B. And if you start to cut this branch, the weight of the branch will actually make it fall off the tree. And as it gets to that A spot, it'll just fall off, because if you don't have that A cut there, it might rip the bark all the way down the side of the trunk. So that's what the A cut is trying to do. The A cut is to make sure that you don't cut that off. And then the last cut is the C cut. And that's the one where if you cut it in the right place, it will heal over very nicely. When you have smaller branches, you can use your bypass shears, or and if you have a larger branch, this one is like a pole saw. So if it's a small branch but it's high up, this is like a pruning saw, but it's on a long pole. So you can basically stand on the ground. You don't have to worry about being on a ladder, and you can do that from the ground, and it's pretty safe. Here's an example of a branch with included bark, and if you look at this, it's maybe a little counterintuitive, but if you look at this line right here, that is how you would cut this branch off, because you kind of get most of the included bark, and if you cut it in that angle, it will heal over. So here's an example of some branches that were pruned properly. These branches were probably about 1 inch in diameter. The picture on the left shows it looking at it straight on, and the picture on the right shows it from the side. So that's what it's kind of going to look like. Now here are two branches from the same tree, or two pictures of the same tree. There were a couple of branches that were cut off this tree. If you look at the one just below the big one, that one's almost healed over. The one in the middle of the branch on the left is about halfway done. And if you look at the photo on the right, that is completely healed over. So that one is perfect. And thank you very much. There were a couple other questions which I can address now. Somebody wanted to know how often to water the trees and how to do it. If you are talking about a small seedling, the best way to do that is just with a watering can, because you're not talking about a very big tree. But you should just water it to keep it moist. You don't want to underwater it. Obviously, if we're having a very dry season, you want to make sure that you're watering something. And even after it's planted, when it's larger and you put in a new tree, you're going to want to water it very well for the first year, because that's when the roots are getting established. It's not really going to do very much. It's not going to grow very much the first year, because it's going to be working on getting its roots back and building up a root system. So you won't notice much in the way of growth or anything like that. But usually by the third year, once the roots are established, then you will see some growth in the tree. Somebody asked about soil. There are varying theories about soils, and my feeling is that you don't want to really add a lot of non-native stuff to your soil, because sometimes the tree or the plant will act like it's growing in a pot and it won't branch out into the native soil if it likes the stuff that it's, the special soil that you put in. So I think it's better to just dig the hole a little bit bigger than the root ball of the plant, plant it at the correct height, and then use the native soil back in the hole. If you do want to add fertilizer for new plantings, your best thing would be to use 0-22-0, which is superphosphate. So basically it's just phosphate. uh, and that will help the roots grow. And that's what you really wanted when you're planting anything new, any new shrub or tree. You want to get the roots to grow first. Um, the other thing you do about watering, if you like say if you're going away or whatever, you can get some gallon milk jugs and you can poke some holes in the bottom, and um, you can, I think you put the lid on, fill them with water, and then put them at the base of the tree. And what that will do is that will slowly release the water in from the milk jug. It'll release it slowly into the ground and keep the soil nicely wet, but not too wet. And it'll make sure it will go into the soil instead of running off the top of the soil. And that's sort of like a cheap way of doing like a gator bag. And a gator bag are those green bags that you see on newly planted trees, but they're supposed to be filled with water. Most of the time they're empty. But that does the same basic thing. You put water in the gator bag and it just slowly releases the water so that the roots stay consistently moist, and that is the best way to have root growth. And I think that's the end of the questions, unless, Jen, are there more questions?
Yeah, there's a question in the chat. How do you know when a sapling is ready to transfer? Oops, sorry, I just lost it. Ready to transfer from a pot to the ground outside? Is it just based on size, or does it vary per species?
I think it will really just depend on where you're putting it and how big of a space it's going in. If you're going to be putting it in the middle of your lawn, I think you're going to want it to be on the bigger side just so you don't run it over. Or just make sure that you give it a nice circular bed with some mulch just so you know that it's there, so you don't run over it by accident. But again, the bigger it gets, the harder it is to transplant. So I would say that, use your best judgment. If the tree is, I would say try starting it in a 3-gallon pot to start, which would be a 3-gallon is maybe about a foot high and maybe about 12 inches in diameter, I think. And that will be a good size. And once, it gets to a good size, take it out of that pot, make sure the roots are not circling around. If they are, either pull them out or cut them and then put it in the ground. But you could put it in, if you know where it's going to go and you can keep it from getting trampled or run over, you could start your seedling right in the spot where you want it to go. You don't have to transplant it at all. But you just have to keep an eye on it because it's going to be very, it's only going to be a little stick that's 9 inches tall, and you might miss it if you're not careful. So it's up to you. You could put it in its final location from the beginning as long as you keep an eye on it, or you can put it in a pot and nurse it until it gets to a decent size and then move it. Any other questions?
Yeah, if anybody has any questions, you can either speak up or type it into the chat. Oh boy. Any recommendations to protect from deer?
Yes. Well, yes. Fortunately, I have a lot of experience with this. Other than getting a gun and shooting them, there's really not a lot you can do. But if you have a small tree and you have bucks around, they will buck rub your trunk and kill your tree, especially small trees up to about 1 to 1.5 inches diameter. It's not going to be pretty, but what you would have to do is you'd have to go to the big box store and get 3 or 4 of those green metal fence posts that are about 4 feet high, and get some of that black netting. And then if you have 3 of the posts, do them in a triangular formation around the tree. Then you're going to take some of that black heavy plastic and go around a couple times to keep the deer from rubbing the trunk, because if you don't, they will find it and they will kill your tree. Where I live here in Metuchen, we have deer in our yard, and they have rubbed every one of my trees that I have not protected, and even some of the ones that I do. So deer are a scourge for the landscape in many ways. So I don't like deer. Anything else?
Any other questions? I don't think we have any other questions. So I'll like to thank you for all that great information. I wish everybody well with their tree planting and tree care as we go forward this spring. So
Thank you very much for
All right.
listening. And if you have any further questions later on, you can always contact the library and I can probably get you an answer too.
yeah, we would be happy to.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Oh, you're welcome.
everybody, good night.